don't want to put the paddle in the water. We love to kind of play with songs and see how they wrap and weave in and out of the message and the text, so I hope you take time to take a look at that. This text this morning, I think, speaks particularly. We're at the end of a 6-week series. We're at the end of this series on the 5 W's of God and the 1 H, the who, what, where, when, why, and then, of course, how. And this morning we're thinking about how. But in particular, it seems to me that I want to think with you about why this one is what I think is probably the most important of all of them. But I got to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm the opposite of Peter Mayer on his song here. I don't even think about how something is made before I jump in. I do a lot of stupid stuff. I agree to do things before I know exactly how to do them. I'd like to say it's because I'm trusting the Spirit to be there. But the fact is I'm just a really high risk taker, but not a really high calculator. I do stupid stuff. When I was 12 years old, I had my first 10-speed bike. It was a 10-speed Schwinn. It's orange. Took it down to my friend's house over at Burton Hill, Merrick Street, near West Side. We were hanging out. It was about nighttime. It was getting dark. I was about to call my mom to come pick me up. I was 12 years old. Had my bike up there. He lived at the top of the hill. He said, "There's some great hills here." I said, "Yes, there are." "How fast, Tom? How fast would that bike go down this hill?" I said, "Well, obviously somebody should try." So I jump on the bike, and I ride as fast as I can down that hill. And, you know, things feel even faster when it's dark and you can't see anything. Which is I didn't see the curb at the bottom, the curve in the street as it comes to the bottom until I hit the car that was parked there. Flipped over the top of the car. 15 stitches later, my uncle comes and picks me up. And that's not the first time he's picked me up. I was on a first-name basis with St. Joseph's Emergency Room. But my uncle, whenever he would pick me up, he would always say, he'd say, "You know, Tommy, you can tell a lot about a person, who a person is, by how they do stuff. By what they do." I said, "Yeah, what's your point?" He says, "Well, I'm pretty sure you're going to end up being a cautionary tale for people." He always closed up he always had these little aphorisms, these little quaint little sayings. I've shared a bunch of my Uncle Mac's stories in here over the years. He's now 10 years gone, but he would say this. He'd say, it's not who are you, but it's how you do. This is the 6th and final Sunday. Who are you? Who is God? But the question really is, how is God? And I think even more important, how are we? Of all the Sundays, it occurs to me that this may be the most important, because whatever we say God is, wherever we say God is, when we say God is, whoever we say God is, it still all boils down to how God is, or how we are. And because these last weeks and even today have been filled with all of these experiences, images, stories of violence and hatred, racial, sexist, gender-based, religious-based, it feels like the world is rife with this kind of anger and confusion and chaos. And it feels out of control. And I'd just as soon do something else. I'd just as soon we could kind of go out for a picnic or something and not think about it. We live and thrive in the face of fear and this pervasive anxiety. And I think it's every bit important right now, if not more, that we try to understand what it's like, how we are supposed to be. How do we experience God in this mystery, in this unnameable present? How do we somehow experience this? And I think that pretty well reflects the way we would ask the question. We would say, where is God? How are we supposed to be experiencing God in the midst of this? I would think that's a pretty common question. We want answers. And I think that question pretty much reflects part of the obstacle that we face day to day. Most of us. And that obstacle is us. Because the problem isn't about me. It's not my problem. My fear is not the problem. making sure that whatever great mystery is in the world, God, however you want to name that ground of our being, making sure that that comforts me right now, that there's some answers, isn't the problem. We might think it is because we're afraid. We might think it is because we don't like chaos. We don't like gray. But the problem is communal. I remember last week, if you were here, DeAndre and I did a dialogue sermon, and one of the points that I made at the end is that we had so much diversity. We actually had this thing on Facebook where we asked everybody to kind of send in to our different pages some ideas, who is God, and we had something like 140 different responses. And I'd say 120 of them were actually different and distinctive. I mean, there was that much diversity of who is God. And as I looked around and said, does that say something to us? I suggested, and I still suggest strongly, that if we were to go around and I was to say, so what do you think about God? You might say to me, it's a personal matter. It's a faith between me and God. And I would say, no, it's not. It's an interpersonal matter. Faith is not personal. Nothing about what Jesus taught ever said, you take your God and go off somewhere. It was always about transforming the world, making a difference, presenting compassion wherever there is hatred. So the problem is communal. So the issue is not, how do I experience God? I'm going to suggest, instead of thinking, in the midst of all this anxiety, how does life, how does mystery, how does God, how does the ground of our being, how do we experience it? Instead, I'm going to say, how does it experience us? How does the mystery in which we live, the ground of our being, as Apostle Paul would call it, how does it experience us? I've told stories in here before about doing camp work. I used to do this camp work for years and years. Brad now does one of the camps that where is Brad anyway? Good. I want to make sure you're here still. The way the morning's been going, I want to make sure you're still here. Brad's been doing one of the camps, and it's just phenomenal. I wish he could do more of them. But these are amazing camps, pediatric camps for kids. The ones that I had been involved with, and the one Brad does, it's a pediatric oncology camp. His is in North Carolina now. There was one that I was doing for years out in Arizona. And these are all kids who had experienced cancer. No siblings. These were all just the kids. They were either in treatment, in remission, just past treatment, some of them literally clinging and staying alive just so they can get to camp. The experience of camp for these kids was an experience of normalcy, at least in the very major sense. That was the priority. It just feels normal. Your hair is gone because of chemotherapy. You've had facial reconstruction. You've got a prosthesis. Any number of things that these kids feel awkward in their life day to day. Now, in the midst of this camp, it's normal. And there was that emphasis on what's normal, but there was this other emphasis on living fully. I've shared in here before, that often all of us counselors and adults that would work there would often leave camp having been profoundly taught by the children who came and participated. And it was the same case for me in my second year at this place called Camp Rainbow in the year 2002, late August. It was out in Prescott, Arizona, in the mountains there, beautiful mountains in the middle of the desert, just an hour and a half north of Phoenix. And you get in there, and it's just a beautiful camp with these kids. And I had this partner that I was hooking up with for the day, because his cabin was going to get to do the ropes course. Now, he was 11. And you didn't get to do it until you started when you were 10 in fourth grade. So if you weren't there the year before, then he which he wasn't, he got to do it this year. He was so excited because the ropes course is challenging. It's a lot of fun, and it's kind of an obstacle. Now Zach was an interesting kid. Zach at 11, he'd had a bone marrow cancer, and he'd had a prosthetic right leg. He'd lost his right leg and had a prosthesis, and he was one of these scrappy kind of kids, He was just kind of a funny, mischievous kid. And we were doing the ropes course that afternoon, and he was telling me all the stories he'd heard about it, because see, what happens throughout the whole week is that you build these legends around the ropes course. It's buried in the woods atop a big field on the hill, on kind of a mountain, really, maybe a few 100 feet high, sloping from the other side where the ropes course is, and then at the edge of the thing is the zip line. And you hear all these stories about the challenges of the rope course and, people that did it, and everybody's like cheering them on. Yeah, and you help one another. You partner up with people so that you can tether to these posts and these logs that are 20 feet above the ground, and you're balancing along them. You leap across a space between two little platforms. It's 4 or 5 feet, just too far to step. So you have to jump. But you're tethered still, but it's that jump from 30 feet up that you're not sure you want to do it. You walk this whole course, and Zach is this mischievous character, he's talking to me along the whole thing, and he looks up and he says, hey Tom, he says, my mom's Latino. And I said, yeah, I heard that. He says, my dad's black. I said, yeah. He says, what does that make me? I said, a kid. And he looks at me and he's like, cool. He just keeps on going. And the thing about him is that the stories about Zach is that he doesn't let anything stop him, right? He's got a prosthetic leg. But he used it, at another camp, he used it as a boat paddle because he didn't have a paddle. And it was made of a fiberglass at the time. And it kind of ruined the joints, And then he heard the story of how he had used his leg to as a bat when he was playing with kids. He'd go to school and it's like, I'm going to defy whatever you guys are thinking. He'd just take his leg off and swing it during recess, playing with it, and break the thing. He'd gone through 3 or 4 prosthetic legs. And as we're walking along and we're both tethered, he taps me. He says, hey, Tom. And I said, what? And he looks back and he taps real hard and it kind of rings. He says, titanium. Like, this one's not going to go down at all, right? And Zach's just got all of this excitement in him, but we've heard stories about the zip line. And it's of course it's built up. These counselors, they're building up this anticipation as well as this obstacle. Rainer Maria Wilkie used to say, to complete something is not my objective. To succeed is not my objective, but to conquer ever greater and greater obstacles. And that's kind of who Zach was. It's like, what's the next thing? So these legends were awesome. The zip line was called the Intimidator. But it had a nickname because there were stories about counselors who kind of lost it once they jumped off the little podium there and kind of lost it in a bodily sort of way, and it got the nickname Airborne Outhouse. And he was like, you think I'm going to have an accident? And I'm like, dude, if you do, I'm right there with you, And so we're getting up closer, making our way across the poles and stuff. And we hear something in the distance. We hear this scream, this high-pitched scream that goes, oh, sweet dear baby Jesus. And it just disappears. And I look over, and it's one of the 10-year-old campers going down, upside down, across. But they disappear because you can't see past the trees. They go out into the field. It's like 700 feet across to this other side of the field where you almost come dangerously close to running into a pine tree. And then you swing back and forth until finally you come to a stop and you dangle there 12 feet and the counselors come and grab you. I looked at Zach when he heard that scream as we heard it kind of disappear off in the distance, and it gets kind of quiet, and he looks up at me, and he's got these eyes now that are kind of wide. He surprises me. He says, Tom, is this thing really safe? And it hits me for a moment. It really hits me. It takes me by surprise because I think, here's this kid who's just gone through cancer treatment, chemotherapy, lost his leg, uses his leg for everything and just keeps on defying it. And now he's anxious. He's worried. And I'm thinking at that moment that we're almost 1 year anniversary to 9/11. It's August the 20th for this camp. And of course, when we came through the airport, all of us counselors were surrounded by security. There was just security everywhere. And then I'm thinking this morning, 15 years or so later, 14 years later, still this anxiety, still this cloud of fear and tension that exists, some of which now exists a little closer to home, to our own community in a sense, as well as across the world. And it strikes me that I'm thinking the same thing. Is it really safe out there? Is life really safe? And where is God in all of this? Who is God? How is God in all of this? This story I find interesting. Oh, we've got screen again. I find this story of Martha and Mary interesting. It's not one that I come to a lot. It's ironic because Casey Orr, who was preaching earlier this morning, she's actually preaching the lectionary, and it's the lectionary text. But that's not how I came upon it. I just started Googling things. I was looking for texts that sort of dealt with curiosity and fear, with facing obstacles. And this was one of the texts that came up. And I thought, this is a really interesting story. But what caught my attention was that this story, we often think of this story as being about Martha, as being preoccupied, and therefore she's not thinking about what's important, which is to be present with Jesus and to be kind of at his feet listening to his teaching as Mary is. She's preoccupied. She's distracted. And we often sort of get this moral from the story that, well, what is it in our lives that get in the way of our experiencing God? But see, I'm asking the question from the other side. I'm asking the Rumi question. It's not going out and seeking for love, but it's seeking for the things in my life that I put up as obstacles to the love that is there. Now, here's why I think it's interesting on this text. Think about who Martha is, right? She knows Jesus. She knows what he is in the sense of who he is, the stories, the legends, the rumors, all of the amazing stuff. She invites this amazing reality into her house. She invites this person of unbelievable possibility, of such great mystery, of such profound connection. She invites him into her house and then ignores him. And then complains about it later. You've had that experience before. You've had that experience where you get mad about something and you start projecting and you start pointing at somebody and you start kind of blaming. But then when you really get down to the core of what's going on, there's some unhappiness. There's some disconnection here with you. There's something that's missing in your life that you're not connecting with. But it's projecting. It's difficult sometimes to know our own narratives when we're living in the midst of them. But I think what this story is suggesting to us is that there's something more than simply being distracted with duties and tasks, that Martha is not able to live authentically. She continues to live inauthentically, like a lot of folks do. Because to live authentically is scary. It can be frightening. I love John O'Donohue. He had this interview. John O'Donohue is this Celtic writer, this theologian who no longer, he passed away about 4 years ago, I think, from Ireland. A brilliant, emotive, passionate writer of Celtic spirituality and prayer, but just a great poet as well. So one of his best books is called Anam Cara, and a big national bestseller. If you've ever had a chance to check his stuff out, do so. John O'Donohue. He was being interviewed on Being with Krista Tippett, the interviewer there, and it's back in 2009. She had asked him about this whole idea. He was talking about we get misdirected because we think it's about us, and we think it's about trying to find God and experience this mystery, when in reality the mystery is here, and it's trying to experience us, but we're missing it. And he says this, he says, we tell stories, and listen close, it's a little complicated, the language, but I think it's profound here. He says, we tell stories about our lives with the most banal and cliche sorts of spiritualities. We tell stories about our lives with the most banal and cliche sorts of spiritualities and secondhand psychological narratives. Been struggling with this problem I've got. Been going around in circles. Same problem somebody else had. I mean, we experience these kind of problems that are so common amongst us, and we own them. And then he says, none of which can hold a candle to the life that is secretly within us, as if our identity is defined solely by our biography, but it's an inauthentic life. And then he says, deep within our soul, there is a place that remains unwounded, seamless, profoundly confident, capable of the deepest connections and the lightest concerns. And that place, he says, I think that is the purpose of spiritual practice, is to mine that place, is to engage with life within and without in such ways that it reveals the sanctuary that is within our soul. You're going to have to go check that out and look at it for a while. The challenge for us, I think, like for Martha, as we continue to live life in all of this pain and all of this shroud of fear, is to be present to the mystery that's seeking to be lived through us, that's seeking to connect us. And it's not our beliefs. I don't think it's our beliefs. I've said this before. I said the problem with our beliefs, which, fine, I don't think there's anything wrong with beliefs except for one thing. How many times are our beliefs actually serving one primary purpose? To define the boundaries around which we live. Define the boundaries around which we identify ourselves. If a belief does not nurture and cultivate that sanctuary in ways in which we are open to the world and the world can experience that mystery through us, then I think our beliefs are serving the wrong purpose. And I think we need to challenge them. Life is messy. It's always going to be messy. We're always going to be like Zach. We're always going to be sitting there going like, this is kind of scary. I just might go retreat to some beliefs over here. I might try to go find some like-minded people so I can kind of make sure everything's okay. I don't blame anybody for that. It's scary. I like going to places that think like me as well because it feels safe. But I'm not sure it's authentic. I'm not sure it's always authentic. The God that is in the midst of our life is in the midst of all of it. My son Tim is cycling across Germany right now. He went from Amsterdam to Germany. 2 years ago, a year ago, he went to Germany. He's going to Berlin to live in Berlin, but a year ago, he went over there for 6 weeks on his bicycle because we do a lot of biking together. He took it over there. He got his bicycle out. He was at a mall on the eastern part of Berlin. And he was cycling around when all of a sudden 2 local police cars pulled up, trapped him, jumped out of the car, and then accosted him, threw him to the ground. When his partner showed up, threw him to the ground, and both of them began questioning my son in German. He could speak German, and so he kept trying to say he was a visitor. He was here on studying at the local school. But they weren't listening. They had got in their head, something had happened, somebody reported a bike had left the building, and they assumed it was and I'm wondering, too, why, because my son is tall, thin, bleach white with red hair. I mean, he could easily be German. But there he is, and they've got him on the ground until finally they're able to wrestle the passport out of his pocket. He stands up, they step back, and they say, "Our mistake, have a nice day." I only bring that up because the irony of it is the fact that who knows what that narrative is. It's not fair to make any judgment based on that narrative. Truly isn't. Maybe there's better ways to deal with things. It's still not fair to simply make a judgment based on that experience. The reality is so much bigger, and until we open up to what that might be, we're going to constantly always make judgments based on our fears. All lives matter. Black lives matter. Gay lives matter. We're going to make judgments based on our defensiveness and not on our openness. And that's the challenge. It's scary out there. But we got to learn to let go and be open to that mystery and allow it to come through. So my son last week, or the beginning of this week, he's paddling from Amsterdam to Germany. And his bike breaks down and a police car pulls up and my son is terrified. And the guy gets out of the car and asks him what's going on and what's happened, and does he have a spare tire? And my son's being very hesitant, kind of remaining a little distant and saying, "No, I don't have a spare tire, but my derailleur broke off, and I just have a backpack, but I don't have, a sleeping bag, but I don't have a tent." And he's like, "Well, where are you going to sleep?" Because it was getting dark. And my son's like, "I don't know, I'll ride into the next town." And he's looking at the bike with the wheel bent and said, "You can't ride." He says, "Put it in the trunk. I'll take you into town." The officer drives him to a hotel. It's like the Good Samaritan. He pays for his room, takes his bike to the bike shop, and says it will be fixed, But he doesn't pay for the bike repair. Tim gets to pay for that. But he paid for his room and got him a meal and thanked, Tim was profusely thanking him. And then emailed us, Facebooked us and said just the opposite happened in the same part of the state, It's such a big narrative. And then he said, and I was aware as we were driving with the police officer who was talking about all of the Syrian refugees, as Tim is riding freely from Amsterdam to Germany, all of the Syrian refugees afraid for their lives are on the other side. They can't get in. Life's narrative is so big. It's so big. And it's pretty scary. At the end of my theology class, you guys come on up. I want to wrap this up. At the end of my theology class back in seminary, I had this professor. I've talked about him before, Glenn Rout. Funny guy. Just a great theologian and such a down-to-earth guy. We had been finished our first year theology class and written our credo, right? 25-page systematic theology. And so he's giving us kind of the summation. He's going to sort of say the farewell. We've turned in our papers. And he walks into class and he starts singing this. Give me a tone here. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. Could you be mine? Would you be mine? He looks at students and says, come on. It's a neighborly day in the beauty wood. A neighborly day for a beauty. You can sing it. Could you be mine? Would you be mine? I have always wanted to have a neighbor just like you. And all the kids, all the students were looking at each other like, is he serious? I've always wanted to live in a neighborhood with you. And he's like 70 and he leans into these 25-year-old students. You. So let's make the most of this beautiful day. Since we're all here, might as well say, could you be mine? Would you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? Won't you be? Please won't you be? Please won't you be my neighbor? And we're all looking at each other, and he smiles and he says, that's it. And we're looking, what do you mean? What's that? I mean, we're kind of laughing at him, but he said, you take the whole story of God and the story of Jesus as the revelation of God's love in the world, incarnation, present, and that's your story. Since we're all here, might as well say, won't you be my neighbor? Zach, when we were finishing up, and we were right there at the edge, Zach looks up at me, and he sees a teenager standing on the platform, the 3-foot platform. It's about 10 feet up. She stepped up there, and she stops. I've seen it happen with adults, with counselors, and even with teenagers. She stops. She gets shaky. She looks at the guy who I swear was from the California coast. He's 18. I'm thinking, can you be licensed to operate this thing? And he's up there going like, dude, it's awesome. Hey, sweets, just let go. Tether you, open your arms, fall backwards, embrace the air. And she's like, she looks at him and she whispers, do I have to do this? And Zach looks at her and he says, it's kind of scary. And the guy says, sure, you don't want to miss it. But Zach says, you don't have to do it. And so she leaves. She climbs back down the Jacob's ladder, the little rope ladder, and she goes off. And Zach gets up on the platform. And I'm thinking, how's he going to do? You know, he's been anxious about this whole thing. And that's when he turns around, looks at me with that same impish smile as if he'd been leading me on the whole time, unsnaps his prosthesis, hands it to the guy. The guy tethers, and before he can practically just barely get the thing tethered, he lifts up, he takes his left leg, he doesn't have the right leg, and he takes his arms and he spreads them out and he jumps from the platform and starts to fall upside down because he's not holding on to the tether. And he's just screaming as he goes down and disappears to the other side. And I step up to the platform, I get locked in so I don't fall, and I'm looking down about 80 feet, and it's pretty scary. And he gets off with the ladder and stuff. He steps down, he says, Tom, bring my leg. And so I take his leg in my left hand. The guy tethers me at the waist, and I lift my right leg, and I reach out with my right arm, and I let go.